comparing old and new institutional economics. And this brings us to Douglass North, the founding father of new institutional economics. That is the second part, and he's part of the trio of Coase, Williamson, and North, I would say, which is after 1970. Now this is called new institutional economics, and you may then wonder what old or original institutional economics is. So let me contrast those. Original institutional economics emerged towards the turn of the 20th century, so the 19th until the 20th century, and it lasted until around the Second World War. So what was the critique? And now we're talking the early 1900s critique of mainstream economics. And there were essentially 4 points of critique raised by original institutional economics. The first is indeterminacy. That is the presence of multiple equilibria. What institutional economists argue is that the optimum may not be reached, and that's one, or multiple optima may exist, and where a country ends up is then the result of things that cannot be explained within mainstream economics. So there's indeterminacy. It's not necessarily the case that what equilibrium you can calculate is also what the economy in the end tends to. The second point of critique is endogenous preferences. So in economics, what people want is assumed to be stable and determined outside the model. So what you want is not affected by prices, is not affected by supply and demand forces, but it's rather it's something that you already have up front, and depending on the prices that you observe in the market, you decide how much you are going to buy from each particular product. OIE argued that what people want is affected by the economic activities that they engage in. So you cannot assume that preferences of consumers are stable and determined outside the model. That is actually should be part of the analysis. And in mainstream economics, it is not. What people want is not determined inside the model. It's taken as given. What's also taken as given is assumptions on people's behavior. And this you know, right? This is the Homo economicus conception of, as Veblen called it in 1898, the conception of man as a lightning calculator of pleasures and pains. So mankind is constantly weighing the benefits and the costs of all the alternatives available to him or her, and picks the one that is in his interest the most. While in fact, as we now know, but it's also became known around 1900, people use habits. The decision making is habitual. If what you do is not necessarily rational, then things that happen around you, economic activities that you engage in, may affect your future choices. Also, if what you decide is habitual, then even though a policymaker may think that he can push you to do something, that may not happen in the end. And finally, they said that the analysis is assumed to be independent of place and time, whereas actually it is not. It's the comment of diachronic analysis. A particular market analysis may lead to different outcomes in different points in time, and that was not included in mainstream economics. Mainstream economics assumed that we always tend towards the equilibrium, and the equilibrium does not depend on the place, so it does not depend on country, for example, neither does it depend on the point in time that you analyze. And OIE was quite attractive to, it was fancy, it was new in a way, around the 1900s. Psychology started to study instincts and habits and how that affected people's decision making. And then the appeal of original institutional economics was that you could include these psychological underpinnings of behavior in the economic analysis. Also, law as a field was developing, and the possibility to include the body of legal rulings, for example, in the economic analysis was appealing to economists of the time. And finally, the promise to have an empirical basis, so to not have the economist sitting in his armchair thinking about economic models, but rather to base the modeling in real-world data and to predict from those. Unfortunately, I said around 1940-50, the original economics started to fade out. And that is for a number of reasons, partly because the rest of the world caught up, and partly because they were so consumed by their own by their own appeals that they couldn't come to an overarching framework anymore. The beauty of mainstream economics is that it has a strong system of thinking that leads to predictions that you can empirically test. And if you want to overthrow that, which was kind of the ambition of original institutional economics, then you should have an alternative. And they didn't get to the alternative. Instead, original institutional economists started to emphasize the particular. Any finding was relevant to that context in which it was found. And then that wasn't really useful because you couldn't predict anything anymore. Also, institutional economists were involved a lot in policy debates, and that matches the above. So they were distracted by pressing policy issues, and they were involved a lot in studying the effects of specific solutions to specific policy issues, and thereby didn't get to abstracting from these specific policy issues to a more inclusive body of theory. And what they had to pass on, Coase then said later on, was nothing except a lot of descriptive material waiting for a theory. So the empirical basis, that was the appeal of OIE, that is also the level at which it remained. So they didn't build from that to develop a theory that could replace mainstream economic thinking. So there were bits and pieces, just as with the empirical puzzle, there were bits and pieces of decision making, but nothing that then the economist could include in its modeling efforts. But essentially what was appealing in original institutional economics didn't develop from the level of a critique. In the meantime, economics also developed. So mainstream economics developed, and for example, game theory and econometrics came up in that era, and Keynesian economics was popularized. Since it was able to do so, the comments that OIE had that economics wasn't based in empirical observations became less important. And also Keynesian economics connected economics better to decision making. So then around 1970, the institutional economic theories of transaction cost economics, for example, were introduced. And new institutional economics then said that it would be good to include recent psychological insights into mainstream economic decision making, right? So econometrics, Keynesian economics, game theory developed, continued to develop, and around the 1970s, a lot of, for example, competition models started to emerge. And again came a group of researchers who said, well, we need to include recent psychological insights in economic decision making. And that led to concepts such as bounded rationality or the study of risk. And also, the focus of economics should be on transactions. I'd say that sounds familiar, right? It's the same critique essentially that 70 years ago was raised by Veblen and his colleagues. And I have a quote from Herbert Simon to illustrate this. Herbert Simon is one of the founding fathers of behavioral economics. And he says, if we accept values as given and constant, if we postulate an objective description of the world as it really is, and if we assume that the decision maker's computational powers are unlimited, then we don't have to look at reality anymore. Because the real world is then the same as the world as it is perceived. And as a result, we can project what decision makers will do. We can make predictions if only we know their values, what the world looks like, and assume that their decision making is that the powers, computational powers, are unlimited. And obviously, Simon said that is not the case, so this cannot be true. This is pretty much the same as Veblen characterizing mankind as the lightning calculator of pleasures and pains. So the critique is essentially the same. And then the question you may ask, and I don't have that on the slide because there's no answer yet, is what the fate of new institutional economics will then be. Will it push away the efforts of model builders who predict economic development for years to come? Or will it also not be able to replace Homo economicus by a more realistic image of mankind? This is where institutional economics has to deliver.